welcome to this episode of Live with Lizzie, powered by the China Project. I'm your host, Lizzie. Joining me today is Christy Bryant. Christy is a doctoral candidate in China Studies at the University of Oxford. Thank you so much for joining me today, Christy.
Thank you.
So, Christy, for starters, can you tell our audience a little bit about yourself and your research?
I have been researching contemporary China or Greater China for the last 3 years. I'm currently a second year doctoral student or candidate in area studies at the School of Global and Area Studies in Oxford. My research looks into the development of anti-Western sentiments and discourses on Chinese social media, particularly in the context of the initial outbreak of COVID-19. So from 2020 till 2022. And the project specifically focuses on an internet term known in the Chinese microblogging sphere as Baizuo, which translates to white left. And through discourse analysis, I explore how this term, how netizens interacting with this term critique the West. And through that, essentially, I hope to explore a little bit more into the, provide more insight into China-West relations and how that's articulated in the online public sphere beyond the official political discourses that we see from China.
Fantastic work. One of your recent papers caught my attention. Your paper sort of analyzing the discourse, public discourse in China about the Chinese perspectives on the Russo-Ukrainian war. As you argue so convincingly in a paper, the Chinese view, the so-called Chinese perspective, is not monolithic. I wonder if you can sort of summarize those views for us. How representative is each of those views you discuss in the paper?
Going into the paper, my first thought was, as with all groups and societies or populations, opinions and perspectives are never quite these whole and homogenous masses that I think we'd like to neatly unpack and deal with. Effectively, I think it's very difficult to take an answer that's not easy to digest. So in the context of great power politics, it's very easy to be tempted by those types of commentary that we often consume in the West, to be tempted by something easier to understand that's perhaps black and white. So when I came across this kind of question of what Chinese perspectives are on the situation in Ukraine, I thought not only could it not be monolithic, it's just not implausible. And for an academic researcher like myself, it's just an incredibly irresponsible and quite a lazy thing to say. Of course, the Chinese perspective that we see in the West is predominantly official and state approved. And so the paper wasn't to discredit that evidence, not at all. It wasn't to, I would never call into doubt those things that we can see quite, evidently, but rather to call into question how united that front is and to just spotlight, understanding things at face value. Again, not to discredit the public statements or the stuff that we see from state affiliated media, but just to question, how concrete Chinese supporters, or specifically even Beijing, there's a lot of layers within just China, but also within Beijing itself, which I'll delve into later. But the obvious evidence that we see is pro-Russia discourse and government's official statements of support for the Kremlin. But I think there is a lot of space for scrutiny in terms of the delays and the hesitancies and the just slight back and forthing within Chinese news media that suggested perhaps they weren't too sure in the initial days of the war how to approach this and how to make such comments. It wasn't, we were waiting, a lot of China watchers in the first couple of days of the war, the first week, waiting for this big statement from Beijing or from some representative to make a big, bold claim about what's going on. And yet nothing really came through. It all kind of just gradually teetered in. And so there was never some sense of this is the official stance and this is where we stand on things. And I think that's overlooked in a lot of the Western, both media and academic circles, quite frankly. In the essay, I cite the Carter Center, the US China Perception Monitor, for its first representative survey of online public opinion in China. And I think it surveyed around almost 5,000 people, and it found that about 75% of respondents agreed that supporting Russia was in China's national interest. And that's, not shocking. That wasn't not news to anyone, but I think it was expected because of the legacy and the discourses surrounding Sino-Russian relations. But arguably, to say that it was just blanket supporting Russia, it doesn't really account for those nuances of which the survey does actually go into the rationale behind the support, and that being the most common thing being for national interest, right? And I think if we delve into that deeper, you'll find there's a lot of variation in terms of individual degrees of support, but it's very difficult to do research on that specifically. You can, at the moment, it's just much more broad data collection in terms of surveys. But I think arguably that is a really big gap in literature, and it might continue to be that way for a while. But I think we should all look at that with a big question mark instead of just jumping to conclusions that they just support, the war crimes or the death toll or whatever it is. I remember the survey also touching on the question of supporting China mediating an end to the conflict, which again is a very interesting way of phrasing China's role. To say that you're supporting China mediating an end to the conflict suggests that China has a role as a mediator, which again means many things. But I don't think that necessarily equates to what we might perceive as respondents supporting the war. It doesn't mean that either. So those are just some general broad trends that were of interest in that particular survey for me. And then again, there was an article by Wang Wen in The Diplomat, who cited several Chinese websites about the breakdown of stances, public opinion about the war. And very interestingly, it was about 40% that remain neutral. Again, I think that's a very significant number. Neutrality to me is much more interesting than saying you openly just support or don't support. Neutrality is a lot more complex, and I think that's just very worthy of closer inspection. And then the other percentages were that 30% supported Russia and 20% supported Ukraine, which again I think are very interesting numbers too. And those who support Ukraine are probably those who have been delving into more alternative sources of news information, which is why I cite, examples of YouTube influencers like Wang Jixian, who, perhaps for younger demographics or people who are more interested in exploring other news media forms, they find other perspectives and perhaps are less likely to be inclined to just follow China, CGTN or bigger news outlets. But yeah, to summarize, I think there's a lot of different, just within these statistics, there's a lot of place for scrutiny. And the issue of finding out more information on causation rationale is a really big question. Given the political sensitivities surrounding the war, neutrality is a position or an answer that is much more complex than I think people would like to deal with.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to come back to the official view a little bit. Do you think there has been any changes since last year, the starting point of the war, in terms of Beijing's standpoint on the war? I mean, there's been some, contention even within the scholarly circle on whether Xi Jinping has changed his mind on Russia and Putin. What's your take on that?
So initially, in the first days, maybe weeks of the war, I remember that a lot of, as I said, people waiting for this big statement, nothing came. And, throughout, since, it's almost been a year, it's just continually be that there's just China, or Beijing specifically, has just faced a lot of scorn internationally for not having a consistent position or stance. And I think, even with Xi's upcoming potential visit to Russia, there's still a lot of uncertainty just going into that meeting. I think there's still so many questions surrounding what's really going to be discussed and whether there's going to be hard feelings or anything like that. I mean, even still, in the beginning, in the first month, I think Beijing has consistently been providing military aid. But in the initial month of the war, I remember Beijing even providing like humanitarian aid, which was something that I'd only come across much more recently than I like to admit. But I think even that is just another small display of just a very not questionable, but it's just not consistent with the image that we have of what Beijing's, that has to go, that decision. I think it was the Red Cross, that decision for the Red Cross to be able to provide, humanitarian aid from Beijing has to be authorized. That's still something that has to go through an official procedure, which again is just very interesting to take note of. In the paper, I considered 2 points specifically. There's not enough word count for me to delve into more, but I first point to China having quite long history of trade relations with both Russia and Ukraine, and Ukraine or Kiev actually served as a very important source of grain and military equipment for China. And I think there's a number of articles that have come out over the later last year, that the Kremlin's decision to invade Ukraine in what seemed for Beijing a snap decision. It was a very significant. There has been very significant economic losses for China, actually, which is Russia's biggest trade partner, and I don't think that is something to be overlooked, because a significant economic loss for China is a very big deal, and I think that even with the costs of everything else, of the worsening of geopolitical tensions and so on, there's just a lot of things that are at play here, and I think that complicates this picture even more so. The other slightly more obvious thing then is the likening of Taiwan to Ukraine, and I think that the reason why Beijing can't quite fully commit to one side or the other is majorly in part to this issue of whataboutism, and if Beijing were to not fully support the Kremlin, how would that look when it came to the question of Taiwan and what that looks like. So I think there's just a lot of hesitancies surrounding these things because of a lot of finger pointing, a lot of contradictions, more so than there is currently, because when it comes to domestic affairs regarding China and its surrounding territories, and the question of Taiwan is such a big one that it's not just about contradictions anymore. It's actually very significant. So I think that is another reason why Beijing hasn't been able to comment too much, or as explicitly as we would have liked. If I could have included more reasons or other things to account for in terms of Beijing's views and considerations, I would say that China has actually declared multiple times its support for sovereignty and territorial integrity of all countries, which obviously can be scrutinized by many, but they have come out and said this, and they have included Ukraine. They have made the point of saying that Ukraine is included in that. And it is even called, Beijing's also called for all parties to exercise restraint, which I would argue is, it also says I think they said that they didn't want to see the current situation in Ukraine. They didn't use explicit terms. They didn't condemn Russia. Obviously, that would be too bold of a move. But to say they didn't want to see what's going on meant that they weren't fully happy. And I think, again, that is another example whereby we can see there are deliberate times that you see Beijing holding its tongue, biting its tongue. And just finally, quickly, there have been a lot of discrepancies and inconsistencies within the party elite, quite interestingly, actually. I think in December, the Chinese ambassador to the European Union, Fu Cong, stated that Ukraine had put Beijing in a very difficult position and has hurt China's relations with the EU during an interview with the South China Morning Post, which I think is just very interesting that such an important representative from the Chinese government would say that quite explicitly. And then again, in January, the Financial Times reported an anonymous Chinese official coming out and commenting that Putin was quote unquote crazy, which I think is just another example whereby, first of all, it's anonymous, so you're never really going to be able to vouch for who that is. But if that is someone who is in the senior, it's an official, so that's someone who's pretty senior up in the party, that is quite a bold comment to make from someone in that position. And I remember, I think towards the end of the article, something that really struck me was that this official also commented that China shouldn't simply follow Russia, which I think answers to this question of whether China is really contemplating what it should say because they don't want to basically break ties with someone who's supposedly meant to be their greatest ally in this big power dynamic. But clearly there are other feelings and sentiments within Beijing that are much more complicated than I think we think.
Thank you so much. This is so helpful. What I will do is I will include a link to your paper in the show notes section so our audience can take a deeper look at your analysis and research. Thank you so much, Christy, for this very helpful conversation.